So on that note, let me switch to English. My presentation will be primarily focused on the EU, that is the supranational level of response to the phenomenon of foreign fighters, which I want to situate in the larger counter-radicalization and prevention efforts of what is nowadays called an EU counterterrorism policy, which comprises of a set of measures that go beyond the phenomenon of foreign fighters, but foreign fighters, at least in the last 2 years, have been arguably the #1 agenda when it comes to the EU response. On a terminological note, and this partly explains also the differences in the numbers of foreign fighters, and there is no consensus definition of who is a foreign fighter. I will be using the one which primarily argues that it's anyone fighting abroad for other than financial purposes. But there are other definitions, and again, this explains the differences in the data. So if we look at the EU response, it's important to note that it is a relatively recent addition to what is still also a relatively nascent EU supranational response to the phenomenon of terrorism, particularly fitting in what is the prevent pillar of the EU counterterrorism strategy, which was adopted in 2005. That doesn't mean that at the level of the EU or the European communities before the EU was created, there was no interest in the problem or topic of terrorism. Already in the 1970s, due to the rise of both intra-European terrorist activities, but also activities of foreign groups carrying out attacks on the territory of the then European communities, there has been both diplomatic, legal, and operational cooperation. One of the predecessor informal groups of Europol was the so-called Trevi Group, where police and intelligence agencies shared information also on activities of foreign people and European people getting training and financing to do terrorism inside Europe. So there are some predecessors of what is going on today, but again, the focus on foreign fighters is relatively recent. We can also argue that the EU efforts to deal with the phenomenon of terrorism and counterterrorism have really come into earnest only after the 9/11 attacks on the United States. So that was definitely what some people in the academia call the window of opportunity, and until we had the first attacks on the European soil, arguably perpetrated by Islamist terrorist groups or Islamist motivated terrorist groups or individuals in Madrid and in London in 2004 and 2005, the primary focus of these efforts was Al-Qaeda. So it was essentially the view that there may be something akin to 9/11 attacks in Europe, that the threat is coming from outside, but that the European Union needs to develop a response internally in what was then still called the Justice and Home Affairs pillar, and somehow primarily we need to coordinate the law enforcement, police cooperation, intelligence sharing, as also already mentioned, Europol is playing a key role there, and the judicial cooperation. Where already from the 1970s there has always been a problem that complicates the fight against terrorism at the international level, and that is the lack of consensus on the definition of terrorism. So one of the significant first, let's say, legal things that the EU has done was the adoption of common definition of terrorism, which sort of provided the minimum level of harmonization of the act of terrorism across all EU member states. This was quite significant because before 9/11, before 2001, only 6 EU member states actually had a definition of terrorism in their criminal legal code. After the Madrid and London terrorist attacks, there has been a significant change of emphasis. It was realized that Europe is not only a target of terrorism, but that we also have something called homegrown terrorism. That is that some Europeans are actually essentially conducting terrorist attacks on the home soil. This, again, is not necessarily something new. What was new and unprecedented was, at least officially it's presented in that way, the Islamist link and the radicalization that was going on in Europe rather than outside of Europe. And because of this, there was this new EU counterterrorism strategy that highlighted the importance to focus on prevention, and much of what is put in the prevention pillar of the EU counterterrorism strategy focused on the efforts of counter-radicalization or understanding what radicalization actually is. I believe much of this will be presented in the following panel, so I will just very briefly summarize the key priorities. If we look at what the EU has been trying to do, it has, number one, been to try to understand the phenomenon. In the academic literature, there is a lot of debate why people turn to violent. That is why we have some people who radicalize to the point that they are willing to use violence to achieve their end goals. It's therefore important to say that we need to also distinguish violent radicalization from regular radicalization, but it's part of a more complex picture in order to understand what drives people to terrorism or to violence in general. There are lots of different ingredients, many of them have been already mentioned. The problem is that at the individual level, why a person catches the radicalization fire, why he or she is radicalized up to the level that he or she uses violence differs. So the ingredients are there, but the specific recipe differs at the individual level. So to understand that, the EU has funded lots of academic research. It has specifically focused on the places of radicalization, initially prisons and places of worships, more recently internet, as was already mentioned in the previous presentations. It was also focused on the study of so-called macro factors, that is the political, socio-economic opportunities both inside and outside of the EU, why people radicalize. And the last emphasis was essentially to find out what is actually a meaningful EU contribution, because much of counter-radicalization and radicalization efforts, as well as general counterterrorism efforts, are primarily done at the national level. In case of counter-radicalization, I would also actually argue at the local level. So it's difficult for the EU to sometimes clarify what exactly is its value added, something that I will return to at the very end of my presentation. Now, since roughly 2013, the EU has specifically focused on the phenomenon of foreign fighters. And in most of the agendas of both the Justice and Home Affairs Council, Europol meetings, Eurojust meetings, all relevant EU agencies and other working groups, the phenomenon of foreign fighters has really been seen as a priority. In 2013, the Ministers of Interior have adopted a set of measures, officially 22, but for the sake of simplicity, I tried to group them into 6 priority areas where the EU is trying to either take action on its own or to help the member states to take action against the phenomenon of foreign fighters. The first, as with radicalization, is to better understand what it is. As was already mentioned, different countries have different definitions and understanding what is a foreign fighter or who is a foreign fighter, whether that includes direct participation in combat abroad or just travel to these places for training, etc. There is now an increasing focus on prevention, especially when it comes to internet. Europol is already running what initially was a German initiative to check the web. It was already mentioned that there should be this European Internet referral unit within Europol, so that is a new initiative. Everything that, if you can see it in the slides, that mentions or is noted with a question mark, that's something that's planned or that has not been implemented but has been discussed. There is a lot of emphasis on travel, obviously because of the place where the foreign fighters are going, particularly to Syria and Iraq, but also other places because it doesn't concern only these 2 countries. The EU has a range of tools. The European Focal Point Travelers, which is administered by Europol. There is the update of the Schengen Information System, where now the member states should input information on foreign fighters. And there is the long saga of the European Passenger Name Record, which essentially is supposed to collect information on passengers leaving and entering the EU on flights. This is controversial. I will return to it. It has been vetoed or stopped thus far in the European Parliament for reasons which I will explain later. There are also discussions about investigation and prosecution improvement. There is a discussion about the update of the common definition of terrorism. That is because in some member states it's difficult to prosecute, especially individuals who are radicalized or traveling abroad, because much of the earlier emphasis was on groups. Also, there is a difficulty in terms of obtaining some of the evidence. This is obviously because of the external nature of this phenomenon. So there is discussion about more extensive use about the European criminal record system, especially when it comes to non-EU nationals, because again, it's an EU phenomenon, but not just the EU phenomenon. There has been also more emphasis on the returnees because of the numbers that have been already mentioned, which also brings about a new emphasis on de-radicalization, which I believe the next speaker on this panel will talk extensively. I just want to highlight that this is relatively recent at the EU level. Earlier, much of the emphasis was on radicalization, how people radicalize. Now it's clear that we already have people who have radicalized, so what do we do about them? Finally, there is the external dimension. As was mentioned already in the first panel, probably the solutions ultimately to this are local. That is what happens to Syria in Iraq. Nonetheless, there is a belief that the EU can somehow help, share information, cooperate with what is left of the public official administration in these countries, plus also at least share information with the other countries active in the area, because the EU is not the only actor, both in terms of international organizations trying to be active. Very briefly, what I see are the key problems at the EU level when it comes to the response to foreign fighters. I would argue that many of the challenges are not new. They are actually old when it comes to the other EU counterterrorism measures. The first one is illustrated on the slide that you've seen before. Foreign fighters is not a phenomenon that in terms of its scale, but also relative proportion, affects all EU member states, and thus different EU member states have different interest in this phenomenon. Even though officially everybody is interested, in practice not everybody is as committed, and I dare to say that includes also Czech Republic. So the data is important to keep in mind. It's also important to keep in mind that different EU member states have different legal, political, intelligence systems, socioeconomic systems, so cooperation is difficult simply because sometimes you don't know who is your partner, either in the other member states, I would argue also to some extent at the EU level, to which I will get later. This is reflected also in the lack of information sharing. Europol in general has struggled with it. If you look specifically at the foreign fighters, the tool which is supposed to be most useful, Europol focal travel points, only 4 member states have put 80% of the 5,000 people who are listed there right now. I'm seeing now the hand 5. Well, my research indicates 4, but I'm happy to be corrected. There is a lack of political consensus on some of the measures, for example, on the need to update the EU minimum common definition. Some member states argue that it's better to deal with this definitional issue at the EU level, at the national level, rather than to bring it to the relatively complex EU level. Because of this, the EU lacks competence in many areas, including, for example, information sharing, but also the education, social aspect, or what some people call the soft aspects, which seem to be crucial when it comes to countering radicalization and de-radicalization. There is also still a lack of consensus in terms of information about the phenomenon as such. Some people have recently criticized that the EU has contributed to this complexity rather than to simplify the complexity, because it has created a lot of networks. For example, the Radicalization Awareness Network, of which I think the next speaker is a member, but there have been many other networks before. The EU has funded lots of research projects. So some people argue that rather than creating beauty by variety, that we need more information. It's now too complex to follow, even for the national level experts, not to say for the regular citizens who easily get confused. There are implementation gaps. The EU can tell or ask the member states, but implementation is at the national level in 99% of the cases. Sometimes it's also the case that the EU legislates, politicians agree, but national police and intelligence agencies are much less excited about these measures. This is also partly a question of trust. Many of the EU agencies are relatively new, and as it was mentioned, information on these kinds of issues is extremely sensitive. Unless you trust the people, quite often at the personal level, you don't share. This is a problem also at the national level, not just at the EU level, but at the EU level is even more extreme. The last 2 points, some of the EU measures have been criticized for failing to take into account their impact on justice and liberty of both EU citizens and citizens of other countries. This is the example of the European PNR effort, which was vetoed down by the Liberties Committee of the European Parliament precisely for failing to take sufficiently into account proportionality of these measures. And finally, the last criticism coming primarily from the academic literature, that there has been excessive focus on Islamist terrorism. Even though we should not forget that, at least according to Europol data, but also according to the academic research, 90% of all terrorist attacks in the EU are not perpetrated by Islamists. Rather, it is ethno-separatist terrorism, which has traditionally been the biggest threat in this area in Europe, or at least in most member states. Final 2 notes on the new challenges. Foreign fighters are a new phenomena. This poses significant, especially legal challenges when it comes to collection to evidence, because these acts are happening outside of the EU. Online radicalization may be happening on servers which are based outside of the EU. So criminal persecution of these people is difficult. As far as I know, and this is the information as of the end of 2014, only 6 criminal cases on foreign fighters have been opened in EU member states, and 9 people only have been convicted out of the roughly 5,000 people who we know can be described roughly as foreign fighters. And finally still, and this is also /old new problem, lack of knowledge, but this lack of knowledge also is complicated by the fact that there is no consensus on the mixture when it comes to the de-radicalization of so-called soft and hard approaches. That is, what do we do with these people who return? Should we primarily criminalize them, put them behind bars, which is, I would argue, primarily in Europe the French approach, or we have the Danish approach at the other side, where they are seen mostly as people who need some help, either psychological, socio-economic, or other types of counseling. So there is, again, a discrepancy in Europe, so to have consensus at the EU level, it's difficult. I have some conclusion points, which I will summarize in 1 sentence. Neither more EU action or less EU action is automatically the answer. The EU needs to be aware that there are other avenues where perhaps it's better to address some of the phenomena, including foreign fighters, but there are a few areas where the EU can offer value added. That is what the member states are either unwilling or unable to do on their own. Thank you.